Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode 116 of the Lift Free and Diet Hard podcast. I am your host, Andrew Coates, and I apologize. I've given you guys a couple of weeks off. I have had three events and 3 weekends in a row, but this one I've been looking forward to. Today's guest is very quietly influential in nutrition in the industry, and he doesn't live in or seek the spotlight, which I'm going to talk about a little bit. I'm very honored to have Dr. Trevor Kashey as my guest today. Hey, Trevor, nice to have you.
Thank you so much for having me. Really such a pleasure to talk to another smiling face for real. Thank you again for having me.
I guess everybody, for those of you listeners who are not super familiar with Trevor, you have a PhD in biochemistry. You've actually worked at a bunch of cool places. You've been involved in medical research, cancer stuff. You've done nutrition coaching for Olympic medalists. You like telling the story of how, Eastern Bloc country early in your career decided they liked your stuff, flew you over, and then after a while you politely declined any future invitations because you've been really building and focused your energy on building Trevor Kashey Nutrition, which is really about regular people, their nutrition, their lifestyle, their mindset stuff. So we had a chat off air a few weeks ago, just sort of a prelim, because I had discovered your media recently. I'm going to talk about that a little bit after, but it's great to chat again. So I guess I can jump right into the fun.
Yes, do whatever you want.
So our previous conversation sort of devolved into a polite argument of who was going to be more of service and helpful to the other. But it was such a refreshing and genuine thing because, there are a lot of great people in our industry, but I also notice a lot of, quote, status-seeking behavior, a lot of attention-seeking behavior. And you were wired to give, and obviously you do a lot of great things with that mindset. So is that something you just grew up with, or is it something you fostered? Why that just compulsion to be giving and be of service versus try to seek the external trappings of fame and success that other people seem obsessed with?
Excellent question. I'll try and make this as reasonable as possible. I see a couple of things. One, like let's just go the superficial route. I think fame or celebrity has its own level of liability. And insofar as maybe you turn into the dancing monkey, maybe something that you say gets interpreted the wrong way, maybe something like you get spun maliciously. So I have those, I think, sorts of superficial fears, like most people would in the context of, let's say, public speaking. Secondarily, I care, at least at this point, and then too, more that like what I want happens more than I get credit for it. Mm-hmm. And I do kind of live by the adage more and more, that sometimes if you want to get something done, you do sacrifice the credit for it. And I feel okay that so long as this thing, selfishly speaking, happens, whether or not I get my feet kissed for it, I take it secondary to seeing really the effect it has on the surrounding environment, and I really get my reinforcement there rather than socially. So although I do take attention, affection, and approval as much as the next person, I have also seen that it very strongly directs behavior away from the things that I love. Mm. And so hopefully that gives you the more superficial reason. And I would say now on to let's call it the risk, like more towards the risk averse side. So getting away from more of the stuff I want and going towards more of the stuff I don't. I also have made myself fully comfortable with like making myself the right hand man, so to speak. Mm-hmm. And I'll give you my logic as to why. In the history of science, that we all have some equivalent when we go through school. We learn about the history of science a little bit. It always seems like crazy rich people have this crazy dude living in the basement doing projects. He had zero worries in the world. They just like, okay, go to your space, right? Dissect these bodies, make these concoctions, learn about this stuff, and then report back, right? And like, what are they called? The patron, the natural philosophers and their patrons, so to speak. And so I really took to that sort of thing where like, really, what do I really want? Like, how many millions does it take? And it turns out not that many. So if just the position, what it takes to get myself in the position that I want to do on a daily basis, takes relatively less than what a lot of people end up striving for the sake of striving for it. So that said, last and definitely not least, I would say that like the advisor to the king survives multiple kings. The court wizard has stayed in that room for 100 years, and every 4 years the guy in the big chair changes. And I saw that every time I watched a movie. And so I went, like that guy whispers and things happens, and he has served 5 emperors or whatever. And so if you can get around, like you said, the trappings of what looks like service or lapdoggery or whatever sort of pejorative term people use, I just look towards what do I want? What does it take to get that thing? And why would I work any more than I would have to get it?
The music part is I actually know you are aligned with a prominent individual who's really doing a lot of good things in the industry. So I actually know who you're sort of serving and supporting along the way, which is quite entertaining because it's someone whose media I enjoy tremendously as well.
Very cool.
Right.
Very cool.
And his book is sitting on your thing, and I don't air the video, so this is going to be an in-joke between you and me unless you choose to reveal it. But
fair enough.
I think this is kind of fun and relevant too. So you showed up on my radar very, like 2 references very, very much back to back. I was at an event where I was supposed to speak with the individual in question, your friend, was also supposed to be in the lineup, but had to bow out. But a couple of friends of mine, Kendra Short and Kyle Smith from Edmonton, they were down there, and Kendra happened to mention that she was now part of your program and supporting you. So it was kind of the first time I think that you sort of stuck in my mind. I was coincidentally reading The Comfort Crisis, popular book, and my friend Krista Scott Dixon, who's one of the architects of precision nutrition, was featured and mentioned how she had hired you as her nutrition coach. We talked about this last time around. Anyway, so I thought this was kind of interesting. So I started to look into your media a little bit more, and ultimately did get connected to you. And I really liked the messaging in the media. So I thought it was sort of fortuitous that you'd popped up twice on my radar. And I thought, well, I really want more people in the industry to know about you and your resources. And I was sort of puzzled as to why I hadn't heard of you before. And it made perfect sense when I realized that you weren't actually out there to try to grow, build brand. Let's say in the same sort of vein as say a Lane Norton, who I think is wonderful, and I think your and Lane's philosophies in media, certainly the information stuff aligns very closely.
Yes.
So I think let's transition into this. Again, you seem to understand the power of having that strong brand and reputation. You still don't appear to desire, and this is an extension of the first thing, to grow that on the same level. So what have you been able to accomplish by not being that public facing or accessible through media? You alluded to the things that you really wanted. So what has that ultimately translated into?
Man, like what a hilariously emotional question, like, sorry. I'm a scientist, man. and every moment I dance in front of a camera, I don't do that. And that would mean I would have to lean on what everybody else does as ammunition for the material I put out, rather than the problems that I solve with the people I work with projects that I do with other people, that, deals that I structure, so to speak, the studies that I run, that my time, energy, resources, attention, whatever word you want to use for intellectual pursuits, percents can only add up to 100, so to speak. And the amount of time it takes, at least at this point, to generate enough material to grow a so-called brand, it takes away from the things that really matter to me, at least right now. And so if I can have a sort of position where I can do what I want and provide ammunition for other people that have the megaphone and desire that sort of growth, then I can build a symbiotic relationship with that person, and we both win. And I could presumably maintain a relationship like that. Like, how many billionaires does it take, Mr. Coates? You know what I mean? So if somebody has a problem to solve and I can help them solve it, then we can come to an arrangement so that we can make that happen. If I tried to solve these problems and make myself a celebrity and run a business and do all these other things, it ends up like, at the very worst case, the very best case scenario, turns into a miserable life.
Mhm.
You know, whether it works or not. And like I said, how many millions does it take? And if you actually sit down and do the math and account for inflation and compound interest and all this other crap that, you know, if you have any limited amount of, you know, personal, financial, whatever, it takes about 90 minutes of your time to figure that out. You go, well, I want this stuff. It would take this much to get it. So I will get that much. And then after that, I can do whatever I want, insofar as I could work because I want to, rather than because I have to. And when you, the royal you, start going towards that branding, that celebrity, that sort of big name status, the reinforcement from the external and the social environment in particular ends up dictating your behavior. In other words, you can't do what you want to do. You have to do what the audience wants you to do.
Mm.
Now, you might luck out and curate an audience that loves the exact same stuff you do, and that does happen sometimes, although counting on that also creates a rather miserable experience. So really, it comes down to, you know, how much influence do you have over the things that you do on a daily basis? And I would rather have more than less.
But we're talking about freedom to do what you want to,
Yeah.
and we're talking about what matters to you. And you know, I can certainly be guilty of encouraging people in the industry to grow brand and reach and ability to get in front of more people, to help more people, because we have all these bad faith actors out there who are taking up that space. And I think ultimately the right people will self-select to that approach. I want to make sure that people don't do it for the wrong reasons, which is to seek status or fame or validation or all these sort of things, which are obvious traps. And I think you're right in that even when you grow to a certain point where you have that many touch points within various forms of media, social media, even I experience it where it becomes fatiguing to try to do all the things. And sometimes you look around, and I can say this from personal experience that I have a lot of great friends in the industry, and I was lucky to spend some time with some of them each of the last 3 weekends at events. But I've also felt moments where there are a lot of really great, wonderful people. I never want to discourage people from reaching out and sending me a message if it's meaningful, but you get more shallow touch points socially across social media. And then you look around, and I've realized this for a while, my close friends often assume I'm too busy with everything I'm doing in my career, that they don't think to reach out. And then, of course, you know, you don't make that effort, and that's the trap. And all of a sudden you end up with more shallow interactions and fewer deep and meaningful interactions. And it's something worth being on guard against. And to look at, I do caution people on this, and again, it's from the status lens. Do not mistake that what you think are all the wonderful things about having a larger social media following and some of the other trappings of what you might think are fame in this tiny little microcosm industry. There's no one famous in our industry. There really isn't. No one's, you know, mobbing Lane Norton or Jordan Syatt as they walk down the street in public.
You know who has the fame in our industry? Dr. Oz.
Dr. Oz does. And
I mean that seriously. Like, you compete with him.
And there's the challenge. Can you show up and help the people who self-select by sharing better information? I think so. One of the reasons why I want people to know more about you and your media is because there are going to be people who understand these dynamics and still understand that it would be fulfilling to reach more people, help more people, and learning from people like yourself and other evidence-based people is going to be a great way to do that, to at least try to be more than a drop in the ocean against the misinformation that Dr. Oz metaphorically and literally represents. But I think it's also worth understanding that it can be a thankless endeavor, and it is that proverbial drop in the ocean when you really think about it. So I think at the end of the day, everybody should be doing it for the right reasons. And it sounds like you are wired correctly, which is actually just that much more reason why I wanted people to hear your perspective about all these sort of things, because I find it's grounding. And even I myself sometimes need to hear it.
I agree. I use an analogous metaphor, funny words to put together. I say I add to the noise. Basically, like, if you do put good information out there, the people who could use the good information, what level of skill do they have to discriminate? Which means that they default to the more likable person. And so it turns into this counter control issue where, even the evidence-based people, whatever that means, fight against each other. I love that phrase because I think of, like, those evidence-based dudes existed 2,000 years ago. They insulting the people gutting their chickens wrong when telling the future, right? And so like, those people existed then, and presumably we will have it just as wrong now as they did then. And so really it just comes down to, what sort of social group do you belong in, who has it least wrong, and if you do have it least wrong, what effect does that really have?
And what you just described is tribalism, right? Which forms in any way, shape, or form. Now, I think you can build a positive tribe around you, but also at the same time, be very, very aware of some of the behaviors within tribes, which is status seeking within the tribe, policing. And a lot of times, one of the problems we notice in the industry, and I like to get coaches to see this and be careful about it, is when you identify so strongly with a tribe and that tribal message and ideology polices other rival messaging that may be agreeing 95%, disagreeing 5%. We saw this with the fragmentation of different denominations and sects within major religions, and that's led to bloody wars. And what we see in the arguments on the internet are just proxies for that same sort of human behavior.
Yeah.
So recognize this, and you understand that there's very little value in the status-seeking behavior within the tribes. And then you redirect your efforts into actually helping the end user and never losing sight of that. I think that's actually how we at least make a little bit more of a dent and earn a comfortable, fulfilling livelihood in the process, that you can keep doing what you love.
Yes. And you bring up a good point. And also, like, this idea of status seeking tribal behavior, I on one hand I agree, on the other hand I agree. And so I will explain what I mean in a second. That unless you have systems in place to determine in an objective way that you've helped your audience or not, you only have attention, affection, and approval of that audience. Mm-hmm. And so instead of, like, you choose, you have status seeking behavior or not, the question then turns into, who do you seek status from? Because you either seek status from this group or that group, and like I said, unless you have machines in place to determine the efficacy of your intervention, which nobody does, you really have attention, affection, and approval from groups that net you, or you will end up seeking attention and affection and approval from the groups that have the greatest reinforcement of giving you that stuff. In other words, like, whoever likes you the most, you will gravitate towards them. So it looks like self-selection, but really you have a lot of interplay here where you only have status-seeking behavior as a way to determine whether or not you have any level of efficacy.
And anybody listening who's like, mine's been turned into a knot with that, well, you know what? I'll challenge you to go back and re-listen to this whole episode just to really let it sit.
Does that make sense? How I like?
Absolutely does, right?
Okay.
It makes sense to me. And it just flips on its head, this idea, because I tend to talk about self-selection a lot, because I think, end of the day, yeah, people who like our messaging, like us and agree with us, tend to find their way to us. I mean, I think there's also other ways. I recently had a discussion with a coach on social media who tends to be very, 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 I don't want to say extreme, but is wired a specific way and is kind of intolerant towards anything shy of this. And that coach was very negative about, let's say, Weight Watchers, right? Because everybody that this coach had worked with who'd come out of Weight Watchers had had a bad experience with Weight Watchers. Now, funny enough, I recently sat down with someone who had a really good experience with Weight Watchers, and I've heard lots of good things. It's not flawless by any means, but as far as a lot of the popular mainstream systems out there, I think it's one of the better ones, because it fundamentally is rooted in, the idea of calories with their point systems, right? Like,
yes,
it's better than most. But what happened with this coach, and I try to encourage her to understand, is that the people who it didn't work for are the ones who self-selected you in your message, and they're finding you when they need to. So I was trying to get her to think less negatively about Weight Watchers as a thing and not demonize it, while continuing to serve the people who ultimately she was best able to help. I don't know if that message got through or not, but I was satisfied with the exchange.
Fair enough. So long as you learn something from it.
So,
Like I said, unless you have a way to measure the efficacy of your intervention, you only have what you know at when it ends. Just like the point you made, like they had bad experiences with Weight Watchers. What does that really mean? It means reality deviated from expectations. And so unless you control for all of that ahead of time, then you just like, that's counting calories didn't work. Well, I counted my money for a week and I still had the same amount after I finished counting it. Like I counted it every day. I counted my calories every day and I didn't lose any weight. Well, I counted my money every day and I didn't get any richer. So what problem do we solve here? You know, like that also kind of gets lost on people. But like the whole idea that it didn't work, what does that really mean? It means that the directions they got presented differed from what they did when they followed those directions or not. And so really like you know as well as anybody, it sits on top of fundamental principles. Like they have proxies for calories, they care about vegetables and protein, like they on a fundamental level, it works just fine. And so saying that it doesn't work really just means that you have a breakdown in like the verbal behavior between the groups. And so what do you really, Royal You, what do people really have an aversion with? Because you could say, well, you didn't lose weight because they used points instead of calories. Well, okay, multiply them all by 100 and you get the calories. Like, give me a break. So you see where I'm going with this? Like, what do you really have to fight against other than the face noise you make to describe the process?
right. And the person who it didn't work for, giving them calories and macros, that wouldn't have worked either, because on some fundamental level, there's something else. There's some sort of other bottleneck. There's some sort of other thing that this person is bringing in with their emotional relationship, their habit, what have you, that didn't allow them to execute within that system. I don't think the system was the problem. It's like this argument where it's very popular to criticize 75 hard in our industry. And my thought to this is, well, this is the industry policing the morality of different things, which I think is not a good use of our time. Because quite frankly, the people who are following you and you yourself, 75 hard is not for you. It's not for most people. That's why it's called hard, right? I think it's for the people who ultimately are wired in such a way that this sort of experience might teach them something. Now, do I think these sort of extreme things set people up to fail? Arbitrary pass-fail metrics? Of course I do. I for sure think that. But I think there's different ways to message within our industry. And I think we spend too much time policing the morality of the different approaches when we would be best spent, spending our time like kind of like what you do, creating things that actually help people.
Yeah,
so
some people call it envy, I suppose, where you spend more time complaining about how somebody else gets it wrong than actually making something correct that also resonates with the people you speak with. And instead of creating that, you sink back into the group of people that reinforce you for essentially complaining. And so I saw this Twitter post many moons ago before I put that down for a while. Like, can you believe this carnivore guy? Who would ever listen to this clown? And I just thought, like, has this person ever considered asking, how come nobody ever listens to this clown?
Right.
So that they listen to this person and they get things wrong, and that people people overtly ignore you. They say, why does the general population like this generally likable person? After I just crapped on this person's character for the last 6 months, how come nobody likes me? And the idea, this hilarious, like pseudo meritocratic sort of language that flies around, and the evidence-based circle jerk of like, well, since I said this thing other people with letters after their names agree with, I therefore get attention and approval, kind of confuses the nature of communicating with a large audience. Like to communicate with a large audience, you almost have to necessarily get things wrong, either because you create metaphors that align with people's previous experiences, and in metaphors, you have blatant differences in context, or you have to make it sufficiently vague that you make it impossible to include enough details to make it technically correct. And so when you speak to a broader audience, you will lose. You will lose. And so I think a lot of people who speak to broader audiences do understand that. And then you just have this dialectic between utility and validity. Did I do bad science? Maybe. Did I do something useful? Yes. And so that in my brain, mind, soul, whatever you want to call it, differentiates the actual evidence-based person. Like, what do I have to do to help? And do the things that help overtly conflict with what other people with letters after their name agree with? Because in reality, if what you do works, well, then it does follow some law of nature. Maybe the way that you describe it differs from the way other people describe it, but if a person loses weight, they lost weight. So I think evidence-based people in general, they seldom ever argue whether or not something works. They argue over the description of the mechanism.
I see this all the time.
And what does that have to do with the population that you actually want to help?
Mm-hmm.
Nothing.
Nothing. I agree with you.
Now, does that mean to go out of your way to get stuff wrong? Maybe. Maybe, like, and I say maybe, insofar as like, have you heard of the some people call it like the Feynman technique?
Yes, where you dive into a topic and then you basically turn around and explain it to like a toddler.
Correct. So yes, we more or less agree. So let's say I learned nuclear physics and I talked to my grandma, or I talked to a 5-year-old, and they both understand what I say. Do any of them get any closer to building a nuke?
Nope.
No. So what gives, right? And now that's sort of like the Feynman, I call it the Feynman fallacy, because that only has a unidirectional effect on what you know. In other words, if you can turn what you know into something that a 5-year-old understands, great. Does that make the 5-year-old any closer to understanding? No. No, which means that you gave them stuff either too vague or too wrong to make a difference. And so we run into this big fat circle again. And so when people listen to people with huge podcasts or big followings or whatever, they fall into that category of they have expert status, they know a lot about the subject, they use this sort of Feynman technique to explain it in an entertaining way, and then people who understand the words that person uses now believe they have the same understanding the expert does. And so that creates its own set of problems, which then the evidence-based community ends up complaining about. Well, it doesn't actually work like that. Well, so what? This guy entertains people.
I mean, I immediately think of Huberman. I'm not even going to go there, but I think Huberman is a perfect encapsulation of what you just described with, your cold baths and what have you. And to kind of complete the analogy, when it comes to things like cold plunges or cold exposure, because, hey, the comfort crisis actually goes into this sort of thing too. Mm-hmm. I think there's with the technical science and what makes a lot of sense. And then there's just the experience of it. And quite frankly, one of my clients told me he recently had a cold shower and he felt great afterwards. He didn't do it deliberately. The hot water tank wasn't working, but
sure,
he said it was quite invigorating. So I think, I get what you're saying with this, and it actually makes sense. And even I can sometimes get caught in the trap of, well, there's, what's technically right. I just try to avoid getting into arguments and policing and fighting over these things.
Yes.
I'm very wired to, at the end of the day, helping the end user. So let's pivot this to something that, if we haven't lost anybody, as we dive into our intellectual stuff. For you, how do you translate this into delivering a message that the end user is able to use with their nutrition, and maybe scale that to coaches too? How do you help coaches take the quote evidence-based stuff and then turn it into something that actually helps people?
So I will tell you straight up that I take my intellectual endeavors and my applied endeavors and draw a very big, fat, bright line between them both. I think, like, if you try to take a study and make it useful for the everyday person, you've already lost. Now, I understand the utility of that for entertaining a broader audience who likes the idea of science. Okay, talking about the cutting edge, like talking about cutting edge science, you may as well read tabloids. You may as well read tabloids.
I love
Like,
it.
you know, the science that makes it, it gets stuck as a paragraph into a textbook 15 years later. Okay, so really, the newest paper that comes out, how does that? I really see it the exact same thing. It's like, oh, Prince Harry screwed this girl over the weekend. It's the same stuff. So that just follows a sort of recency bias, like because it came out earlier, it takes precedence. Now you have the equal opposite issue of like ancient wisdom having power as well, which creates its own problems, ancestral, whatever. So I would say at those two ends, you really have like what has survived the longest and has gotten corroborated the most times. And this gives you the basis of decision making and an operational philosophy. In other words, I really give two craps what the science says when I work with a person one-on-one. I really care very little about solving the problem or getting to the crux of the problem. I make the joke and say I care about getting to the crux of your problem. And seldom does anything that came out, even that recently, directly apply to that person's situation. I can count on both hands, maybe my feet, when that has happened because of very interesting medical conditions. But really, from the general practitioner standpoint, the fundamental principles of all the things that we want to accomplish really have existed for a century or more. And so going much later than that, I see the entertainment value for yourself and others. I see intellectual enrichment, etc. I see limited practical value for people that want to live a better life, frankly. And so for that reason, I try to start every conversation with, tell me what problem you want to solve. And after we figure out the sort of problem a person wants to solve, often what they first say actually deviates from the problem they want to solve by an eon. Really, they just list some sort of outcome they want to avoid, more than a problem they want to solve. So this allows us to start a sort of Socratic dialogue where we can go back and forth with, well, like, how do you actually know you have that problem? Like, what would happen if you did nothing? What would happen if you did this more times, that more times? And so from here, I tend to shift the focus more onto skills and skill acquisition, which has its own host of literature, which I love. Although I will say that the basics of skill development have existed for 80 years or more, and everything else has more just corroborated those basic, I'll even consider them laws at this point because they work transgenerational and interspecies. But really, you have this problem that you want to solve separate from some result you want to avoid. Okay, so once you figure out you have some problem you want to solve, well, then we ask the question, well, what contributes to this problem? Well, we have three different things that contribute. We have the outside world, other people, and us. And then we ask the question, well, which of these things, sub-things within those three categories, do we have influence over? Less than we want and more than we think. We do have some influence over other people. Do I have to text her back? We have some influence over the environment. Do I have to keep everything in the house? Do I have to go to the bar? No. So we do have way more influence over external factors than we think, although less than we would want. And I think the extreme ownership sort of vibe actually confuses things a little bit, because I think that tends to lead towards people punishing themselves more than actually seeking solutions. by just saying, yeah, it's all my fault. Really, you also kind of end up throwing your hands up at the same time. I have noticed, at least with the typical sort of person. And so really, when you see how the environment, other people, and you contribute to the problem, and then you see how these things intercalate with each other, you can then ask the question, well, what sort of stuff do I do to improve it? And what sort of stuff do I do to make it worse? And that leads us to, I asked like basically 4 basic questions, but really I asked 2, maybe even 1, of like, well, what thing do I do too many times? Because you might do something too many times and that makes your problem worse. Or you might do something too few times and that keeps the problem from getting better. Maybe I do weight gaining behavior too many times. And I do weight losing behavior too few times. Now, do we have to get into mammalian targeted rape and myosin signal transduction? No, we stop doing dumb stuff. And we do more smart stuff instead. And I use that sort of silly language, which again, maybe technically, philosophically, and all the other sorts of wrong. Although when you work with an individual, you can see that, well, this person has a problem they want to solve. What things can I do more to make it better? And what things can I do less to make it better? Now, some of those things you probably do already. Some of those things maybe you do none of. Like if you do it too few times, that might mean you do it 0 times. If you do it too many times, maybe that means you only did it once. I killed people too many times. 1 time is too many times. Okay, so it goes all directions, right? And now we ask the question of, okay, of these behaviors that you do too many times or too few times, maybe we have a conversation about skills now. What raises the probability you do this thing more or less times? Have you acquired the behavior in such a way that you can do it under the right conditions at the right time? And now we can start having a conversation of, okay, how do we orchestrate a situation where you can learn how to do the right thing at the right time enough times at a great enough intensity? Which, this gets kind of like super specific and super vague at the same time, but really like you can apply this to all sorts of common sense stuff. Like what parts of your environment make it more likely for you to do dumb stuff? We can modify those parts of the environment, So the idea here, again, having the Socratic dialogue to sort of, diagnose a problem, figure out what sort of things we can do that can make it better, what sort of things that we do to make it worse, and of the things that make it worse, what makes those things rewarding? And then how can we take the rewarding nature of that thing that actually makes our life worse and make it less rewarding, remove the reward entirely, or substitute it for something else? And so those sorts of conversations now, which do have a very strong grounding in science, a science that very few people pay attention to, mind you, that really have very little to do with calories in and of themselves, really, in my opinion, get to the sort of nature of, to keep it in the context of things like fitness and health, your health comes from what you do, not what you know. And so this idea of, well, I learned all this stuff about polysaccharides, I'm going to tell everyone I know about it tomorrow. That'll fix everything. Like, no. When does that help to anyone? I mean, sometimes it has an accident, but really, again, your health comes from what you do. It comes from what you do too many times, and it comes from what you do too few times. I like to make the joke that it's not whether you're diabetic or not, it's how diabetic are you?
That's actually true in a way, right? It's just because
we have an arbitrary cutoff.
Yeah, let's literally actually define that. It's like it's where's your blood sugar? How well does your insulin system work? And there's a point on that spectrum where it works quite well, but it goes beyond a certain point on the spectrum where it's working very poorly, and you could have your feet cut off or lose your eyesight as an example of being too far down that spectrum for too long.
Yes, quite the hassle.
Yeah.
And so how do you fix that hassle? Do you fix that hassle by learning about the islets of Langerhans?
No.
No, you go for a walk after you eat. Come on, man. So I try and like, even this sort of conversation we have right now, I would say like, simulates almost exactly this, like how I would operate in a coaching session.
And
I pull out the Seinfeld. I try to make things as ridiculous as I can. And if I can help it, I try to get a person to laugh at their own problems.
I'm enjoying this part. I mean, you remind me of a couple of other people, pals of mine who are good. I think they're actually pretty good communicators about these things in the context of their audience. And that's Dr. Mike Isertel and the muscle doc Jordan Shallow. And they're they share your combination of intellectual capacity and articulate nature with a natural sense of humor in the delivery of the things that they do. So hopefully, anyway, people are like, oh yeah, love those guys, and they dive more into your ship. I like this. I actually think this is fun. And the thing that sort of hit home with me, especially, is the focus on skills, right? And because we talk about a lot of other things and habits and whatnot, but ultimately, at the end of the day, if we help people facilitate these skills, then these are things that they can execute on consistently for the long term versus have to rely on guidance and motivation at all points. I mean, and again, some of the stuff for sure is admittedly general, but again, if as coaches, we turn around and we help people acquire these skills, it's not enough to tell someone to delete the food delivery apps, which is something I like to point people to do. I think that actually is quite useful, but it has to be paired with the skill acquisition of being able to learn how to cook food at home.
What do you do instead?
Yes. Right.
Yes.
And yes, I think there's an important realization in getting people to understand, because there's barriers to that too. We have to get someone to be willing to learn that skill. But yes, it does start with, okay, it doesn't take as long to cook something at home as people build it up in their mind. It probably takes as long to cook a lot of things as it does to get in the car, go out to the drive-through and circle back around and get back home again. And quite frankly, especially in cold winter months in places like Edmonton, Canada, I would rather cook than go outside anyway, right? And you have to have those materials in the first place. So you actually have to go through Costco or wherever anyway. There's a little bit of planning ahead. Okay, that's a skill. Planning these sort of things is a skill. You can acquire that skill. And then the cooking skill. Okay, cool. You're no good at cooking. Can you crack 4 eggs on a stove and scramble them up a bit, a little bit of salt on it, cook that? That's fantastic. I like that as a good protein-based meal. That doesn't require a lot of skill. Okay, cool.
And how many coaches have set up a call like this and cooked breakfast with a client?
Probably not many. And admittedly, I haven't done it. So
I recommend it. I really do, my friend. I like quite a rewarding experience, because you realize things that feel so obvious to you just make the biggest, like it takes an infinitesimal amount of again, like motivation, attention, affection. I go back to the 3 A's: attention, affection, approval. They just need to have somebody they care about tell them they did it right. Sorry for yelling. Like I get really weird about this.
I like this. Well, it's passion, right? Keep going.
And unless they have the feedback from a reputable source in real time, they only have what they have done in the past. Learning to me means I have the same conditions and have done something different. And so unless a person gets presented with the same conditions as before and does a different thing, from where I sit or stand, wherever, like I do a combination right now, have they really learned anything? Well, from an operationalist standpoint, I would say no. And so we confuse giving people instructions with teaching them things. Really, when you give somebody instructions, you force them to teach themselves things. The teaching comes from having one-on-one interaction, or like it works almost like a cybernetic sort of system where you have inputs and outputs and feedback. So unless a person gets near immediate feedback whenever they do something, you leave them hanging. And if you say you've done it right, if this happens, you've left it to them to give themselves their own feedback for something they know nothing about. And call that teaching. Sending somebody a set of directions and calling that teaching tells us everything wrong with how we educate people. Or saying it out loud, right? So really, you know as good as anybody, especially in the field you roll around in, pun intended, tacit knowledge goes really far, man. You can talk to the godfather or godmother of your field. They can write the most detailed book on planet Earth. You spend one day with that person and you will learn way more than that in between the lines of that book. Nobody can get all the details in. And as a coach, how can you rob somebody of that?
And there's an element to this too that goes hand in hand with this. Coaches can get very awful at taking so much ownership. I mean, I've read the book Extreme Ownership. I think there's a lot of good lessons in there. It could be simplified into probably a paragraph. Good example of how sometimes books really don't need to be books. But I think knowing that stuff, great. But then if we take it too far, and especially when it comes to the context of our clients, if we always take ownership over everything, we rob the person of the ownership to actually make those decisions for themselves. Where instead, if I'm interpreting this correctly, the best course of action is to be very collaborative, but single out the skills that are going to give them the most bang for their buck. We try to throw too many things at them, too many concepts at them. They get overwhelmed and confused. They don't change anything at all. But if we actually surgically identify, okay, what's the bottleneck? What's the problem? What's a skill that if you work on this one particular skill is going to yield the greatest dividend, greatest reward, greatest change downstream, then that's how we actually set those people up for success and change. And if they do a really good job with that particular skill, then, well, they're probably more receptive to learning other skills, but they're probably further along to the point where they can then start to do one or more of those skills.
Yes.
That's a very, Krista Scott Dixon PN sort of concept as well, which I think is, in a big way where Krista has, developed her skill set and her teaching as well.
Yeah, she has a very sort of, I guess in a matter of speaking, sort of Bandurian ilk, like the, precision nutrition is sort of, corporatized the language, but really we just call it self-efficacy, right? If you get evidence that you can do something, well, now you have the ability to get positive reinforcement outside of the social environment. So if you know nothing, you will suck too much to get a good enough result to get rewarded. So what do? You have somebody who knows what to do that says, I know you got this part wrong. This in between stuff you did real good. So if you have somebody to sort of pat you on the butt while you suck, that drags you along until you get a legitimate sort of environmental change that gives you what people would call intrinsic reward. So really, you can do a really bad job at cooking, although if you have an expert cook standing next to you, they can tell you what you did right and give you feedback on how to change for the next time. And that means that even though you did screw some stuff up, you did better than before. And then eventually you can cook a delicious meal all by yourself. And do you feel like you need the coaching anymore? No, you get intrinsically motivated to cook. In other words, you now get positive reinforcement from the environment instead of from some other person. So to me, the coach fills that gap. The coach fills that gap of, I suck too much to get rewarded the first time on my own. And so this person gives me kudos, attention, affection, approval, tokens, whatever we would call it, in the meantime to say, look, you did great. I know the result came out different than you wanted. I know more about this crap than you, and you did good. And they say, it still sucks, but okay. Right? And the next time they do a little bit better again until they make the basket on their own. They hit the ball, into the, what do you even call the hole when you golf? They putt and get a hole in one. They do the thing, they get the stuff. And by having somebody there who knows how to do it, where you can sort of do a sort of like successive approximation, or what people call baby steps along the way, to me, that represents coaching, not giving somebody a set of directions and say, talk to you next week, maybe. Does that make sense?
It's all the sense of the world. This has actually been one of the more beneficial conversations I've had, because I've said this at least off air a lot and probably on air a few times. These podcasts are inherently selfish. I really don't give too much of a rat's ass about what everybody else gets out of this. And I'm actually being facetious here. I'm enjoying these things for myself and getting time to spend listening to this stuff. I've gleaned a lot of insight from this, and I'm actually going to see how well I apply it within my coaching conversations because it helped me reframe and put to the forefront the fact that let's actually really target, all right, what is the most immediate skill that is going to help this person make tangible improvements in their experience and outcome? And then, all right, well, once we've done well with that, let's go back to the start of that again. Obviously, this is a very surface level, dive into a lot of resources and a lot of stuff that you've developed. So let's share with people, where can they find more about your stuff? Because you also have basically a nutrition certification. You have formal coursework that, I mean, friends of mine literally have gotten into. And I'm going to tell you right now, Kendra, who will probably want to listen to this because she was excited knowing that you'd be on here.
I look forward to her feedback
She
as
is
a coach.
a raving fan. She absolutely loves what you're doing. She really believes in it. I know that she's taken a pivot. I've known Kendra and Kyle for quite a long time. And, they came down to a conference to see me speak and see some of the other speakers, which included Dr. Elaine Norton, back in December. And this is again when she told me, and incredibly excited that she was pivoting to dive more into your work. So she's a very good brand ambassador for you, which again, that was partly on the strength of that and partly on the strength of Krista Scott Dixon's raving endorsement. And Krista will be a speaker at a conference I am hosting in October. She's a Canadian powerhouse and an awesome human. And at a previous podcast guest, so everybody listening, go check out my episodes in the past with Krista. But let's direct people to your resources. Where do they find them?
So I recommend people go to trevorkasheynutrition.com because I really recommend people go there. Very few people know this because I spend, limited amount of time talking or bragging about or whatever. I've got a team of like 25 people. So when you inquire with us, a human will respond and you can talk to us as much as you want. We will direct you to wherever we find best for you. Okay. I've started doing the social media stuff again. I took a break because I had a big project and that just took precedence over entertaining everybody else for a little while. But really, you can find me on Instagram at Dr. Kashey, TikTok, etc., all those cool places. But really, trevorkasheynutrition.com has the bulk of the material, has the sort of, the lay philosophy, has a few ways to contact us. And like I said, we have a team of humans. And if you inquire with us, we will respond fast and really tell you whatever you want to know. We can only tell you if you ask.
There we go. Everybody listening, guys, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I was excited to get Trevor on here because I did want to share him with you guys. Because as I said, you haven't necessarily been overly public facing, but the people who know about you, they have great things to say. You're obviously very smart, very well educated, and focused on practical things that actually makes people's lives better instead of saying great sounding platitudes that give you the approval of the self-selecting audience that already likes what you're doing and makes you feel really good about what you're doing. So it's actually about changing people's lives. You got a great reputation for that. Guys, go dive in, and instead of just continuously seeking more information, actually use some of this stuff, act on it, change your clients' lives for the better. Again, Trevor, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.